Hi, my name is Alex Casano, and I'm the events coordinator here at the Clearwater Historical Society. Today we'll be having Ed Hoffman. Ed Hoffman is a notable architect in the Tampa Bay area, and he will be speaking today about Florida aviation history. So I hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm Ed Hoffman. I typically say Hoffman Architects because that's what most of my presentations are about. Architect from Tarpon Springs. I was born in St. Pete, grew up in Tarpon Springs, actually with a quick stint in Clearwater, Greenwood Apartments for a year when I was 2, and then a year in Dunedin, downtown, before we moved up to Lake Tarpon in Tarpon Springs. My father's an interior designer, did a lot of work here in Clearwater, projects that are no longer here. Part of the history, and then when we were on the lake, he moved up to Lake Tarpon. Then he moved his office to Tarpon Springs from St. Petersburg, because he was born in St. Pete, grew up in St. Petersburg, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And he was part of the Tarpon Springs Historical. In fact, he started it with another friend of his. Started the Historical Society in Tarpon Springs. Was president for 25 years. Kind of really got that going, and because he was a passion for history. And so he, and then fast forward a bunch of years, and now I'm president of the Historical Society. I show this slide to kind of begin with to say that so many of our images of history are black and white, and you kind of forget that people back then weren't living in black and white. They were living in color. So the people flying around Florida were seeing these kind of shots, not necessarily with all the boats, speedboats particularly, but this is the kind of thing they were seeing. The shot you're seeing is out of my little flying boat looking at, this is Three Rooker Island. Of course, Palm Harbor is back this way. And then Anclote Key, the Anclote Lighthouse here, and then that's Tarpon Springs back to the east. So what I'm going to do is this show is going to be a little bit reflective of my ADD. It's going to be all over the place. so we'll see how it comes out, and I'll try to get you out of here for some lunch before too long. Doc Brown, my dad had started the Florida Aviation Historical Society with a buddy of his, Russ St. Arnold, from here in Clearwater. And I'll talk more about both of them. But part of their team was Doc Brown, and Warren Brown is his name. He lives in the Indian Rocks. He's been part of it, but he's an author. He actually he wrote the book Florida Aviation History, which is very, very thorough. He's written. Well, he's part of the World's First Airline, which is another book that they've put out. I have a chapter in. It's called Tales of Timeless Wings, and it's a chapter about my dad and I, and here's our little airplane, or one of them. And then, so when I went and met with him, because I thought, well, let's go to the source in preparation for this, he had slides and all, but he found this presentation he'd done years ago, so back in 1980, I think. And so I'm going to use most of that. And then I'm going to switch to something more current, which is my experience in flying the Benoit replica, or reenacting the 100th anniversary flight. So, Lincoln Beechey, he was the first one to fly in Florida. I'm going to try to talk about Florida history, aviation history, and then kind of come down a little more local. So that was 1910, was our first flight there. And he was considered a daredevil pilot because he could do aerobatics and stuff, and he had course, ended up in demise in San Francisco in 1913. But, of course, kind of want to take you back that this is, Pinellas County was very, very new, very, very, very the beginnings. We're stuck on a peninsula, and trying to get to Tampa was a big, big event. So they had this ferry that would go around and kind of hit three main spots. It would go to St. Petersburg, Tampa, and then down to Bradenton, and kind of make that triangle, because obviously there was no skyway bridge. So there were two boats that were making that regular line, and again, it's a wonderful classic boat, a big ferry. And so that was in lieu of the Gandy, the Howard Franklin, the 275. So that's where everybody went down to the wharf and got on the boat. 2 to 3 hour trip at least, costing $1, and we left at 9 o'clock in the morning. Then they brought in a power plant to St. Pete, which is a big deal. Population of 9,000 people. And there was a streetcar that actually ran down Central Avenue in downtown St. Pete. The electric plant, though, actually came from Tarpon Springs. It was there originally. Tarpon Springs actually has a lot more older history than St. Pete, because that was a port with the Anclote River. I mean, the Native Americans were there a long time ago, but you got to do the Cedar Key and then Tarpon Springs, and then go south. So they had this railroad pier when they brought the railroad into town, and it came down First Avenue, and they had a lot of fun. Sorry, these pictures aren't bigger because they're fun to look at the way the people were dressed. The ladies all dressed up to go fishing, right? Her fishing pole, and they're using bamboo poles and stuff, just like I did when I was a kid. But and they're right on the edge. I mean, they're fishing out here in the water, and pretty treacherous. But there's no handrails and ADA stuff. It was pretty rough situation. But then there's the other way to get to Tampa, of course, is they called it the tug and grunt, which is a little steam engine that would take you pull some cars around over to Tampa, and that was pretty much a big part of the day. And of course, if you tried to drive it, that's going up through Oldsmar and all. That's a real long day if you could depend on how many tires you had to change. But and then there was a fellow, the first guy to actually fly in St. Petersburg was this guy, Bonnie. And Bonnie had been from Long Island, learned to fly up there, was flying some airplanes. And he ends up flying out of St. Pete with this airplane. It's a Curtiss. The Curtiss airplanes, and unfortunately you can't see this very well, but it's a biplane, an old biplane, but it has a couple of wings in the middle, between wings, because he was in a fight with the Wright brothers. He was always, the Wright brothers were very protective of their rights to the first flying machine. And they claimed that, when he wanted to use an aileron on the wings, they claimed that was copyright infringement on their design. So he puts these little wings in between the two wings and for aileron control, for rotation. And so that's just a little side story on that. Then he ended up building this wild machine here, which was called the Bonnie Gull, and unfortunately was killed in that airplane.
I'm seeing a pattern here.
Oh, there is a big pattern. There is a pattern. Most of these.
They didn't make it to retirement.
Not a lot of them. None of the people that made history anyway. And then, but he brought this thing to St. Pete. This is a Wright flyer, so he doesn't have those things I was talking about. But they had. He was going to do an air show, and but he was trying to get people to pay 15 cents to to watch this demonstration of flying, and then he ends up, he was very upset because people said, why should we pay 15 cents when we can stand outside and watch him fly around? You know, so that was one of the challenges of doing air shows in St. Pete there at Albert Whitted. And we'll talk more about Weeden Island in a moment. Then there were dirigibles, 1910. These were some of the early dirigibles, and at the Tampa Fair. And that's where a couple of women actually jumped out, girls jumped out of the dirigibles with parachutes. 1910. I mean, I don't know, that's a lot of nerve. You know, yeah, so that was pretty interesting. Actually, Historical Society, which my dad was working on a design they wanted to build one of these. I thought that'd be a lot of fun to putt around, you know. It's a little dirigible. You sit on a bar. They had this kind of fuselage underneath here, just open frame, and you sat, that's him sitting on the frame, hanging underneath this dirigible. Then they had a little motor that would pop up, you know, kind of pull him through the air. And then a big part of the story is everybody heard a lot about the Benoit flying boat. The replicas hanging up in the museum that my dad built down in St. Pete. Tom Benoit was, some people say Benoist, most people say that's Benoit. But he was from he was a Yankee, way up north, but he's a St. Louis pioneer, and but he was accredited for designing and building a lot of different airplanes. Some of them are the Smithsonian, some of the early airplane. And he's the one that actually built the flying boat that Tony Janis brought down to do the first airline. And this is Tony Janis. He was a young guy. You know, he was, I think he was 20. He was in his 20s when he came down as the pilot to be. And he played piano. He was real good. For one of his days, he was very good with the ladies, you know, and very, very popular guy and very flamboyant. But he ended up, when he was doing a demonstration over in Russia, he crashed into the Black Sea. They tried to put too many people in his flying boat, and that didn't work out. Unfortunately, they never found his body or anything to pay tribute. But just before that happened, though, it's up in Missouri. He takes this guy up, and there's a parachute, and they make the very first parachute jump from an airplane. They'd done it, obviously the girls had done it from the dirigible, but he's actually the first one to jump out of an airplane, and which another risky move, but it worked out. It worked out great, and so did it again just a little bit later with a second jump. You can see his parachute hanging underneath here. This is Tony Janis. This is the the fellow there that jumped. I only say that as background to who Tony Janis was here in St. Petersburg. And then also about the Benoit. They were flying their seaplanes down the Mississippi River from St. Louis, and they were going down to, they were heading south, and they would stop. They were taking this beer down, trying to get to New Orleans, and they were taking this case of beer to give to the mayor, this one mayor to the other mayor kind of a thing, and he's delivering it as their airline kind of a thing. And so, anyway, he gets here, and but unfortunately the airplane this airplane caught on fire and burned. So, they were out on airplanes, so they bring another airplane down, and with Tony and J.D. Smith. So then Tony, of course, I just talked to you about Tony, but J.D. Smith is another fellow that's pretty important too, because he was the mechanic that put the airplane together and keeps the thing running. But then he also was a pilot. He had learned to fly as well. So he was part of an aviation school that they set up in St. Petersburg. So anyway, they made a lot of stops. They finally made it to New Orleans for dropping off the beer. About this time, though, this guy, Percival Fansler, believe he was. By the way, don't take any of this stuff for being the truth. These are my scattered memories. This is a general idea of history, but I believe he was, and it's in the book. I believe he was from Jacksonville, and so he decided, well, let's start an airline and start a scheduled service where you could fly across the bay with these flying boats that they had, because this is Tony Jannus and the Benoit flying boat. This is what they used for flying across the bay. And so it's kind of funny. I think he's got I should have put him, I have a similar picture of me in my airplane years ago with using the squeeze bulb to run the air through to make the trigger go on the camera. So he's taking a self-portrait with the camera out on the wing. St. Louis down in the river in the background. Anyway, one of the amazing things about this airboat line that Fansler puts together is how quickly all this stuff came together. Fansler shows up in St. Pete early December. By the middle of December, they sign a contract for the airline with Benoit to bring the airplane down. On the 28th, the airplane shows up with Tony, and they arrive, on the 28th. This is just after Christmas, right? 25th being Christmas, 28th. And then, boom, on the 31st, the airplane arrives on the 31st. JD and Tony ended up coming here a few days earlier, but then the airplane shows up on the train. They put it together overnight, and then they fly that next morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, January 1st, 1914. And that is documented all around the world now as the first scheduled flight, where they were doing flying people on a regular basis. You could get a ticket, you could buy a ticket to Tampa, the flight leaves at 10 o'clock, you're going to go unless the weather's bad. So, and then you were going to get a return flight back. So you could count on when you were going to get there and when you're not. Although sometimes they had to land and do a little work on the airplane in the water there in the bay, do some adjustments, fly you on the rest of the way to Tampa. So down on the St. Pete waterfront, there's the pier, the new pier. But this thing was this first pier was done by the guy that had delivered all the railroad ties for the railroad that was coming into St. Pete. And he built this, it was called the Brantley Pier, because this is 1896, so this is pre-flight here. But, so he does this, because I guess he's in the lumber business or whatever, with these railroad ties, so he could also do the pier, the big pilings for the pier. So he does that, and so then they could bring boats out here. But he also brought the power plant down there too, so it was also known as the electric pier. Then the city ends up buying it later. City of St. Pete, it becomes the municipal pier, and that's the pier that we end up knowing today. It was the $1 Million pier, with the old classic Spanish building, and then of course the pyramid, and now the whatever it is. And Spa Beach here, and the existing museum, history museum, St. Pete Museum is right here where the replica is hanging. They also dredged around here, so where they actually, Benoit, Tony Jannus set up his operation in a building here, which I'll show you in a minute. And that's very close to where the replica, well, not the replica, but the sculpture is now. And I'll show you that in another moment. Then there was another pier out here, which was the railroad, the other pier. This is Atlantic Coast, and the Orange Belt Railroad came out here, and they had, the boats docking out there. And that's where I think the picture was of those people fishing, not on the old pier here. So, and then Albert Whitted, they started dredging that in later. More recently, as 08, this is kind of what you're seeing. This same with the municipal pier here, and then Demon's Landing is where the old, where the second was with the railroad out there, and then they dredged up and built Albert Whitted Airport down here. I'll show you that a little bit more in a minute. Tony Jannus had an older brother who was also learned to fly with at the Benoit School up north. Came down and was also flying with them down here. This is Tony Jannus and his brother, and then Fansler. Fansler, this is him with and without a hat, and the Benoit flying boat. I'll get more to that in a minute. This is the building that he built for his hangar, and that they also started a school there. So they were flying out of there and teaching. He brought also a little training flying boat down, and so this is a building. That's right now where the sculpture is, the new sculpture of the airplane. So then they did the mayor, well, he was a former mayor, Abe File. He was the very first passenger, and that's because they were raising money for municipal projects in St. Petersburg. And he was the high bidder. This is him here. Here's Fansler, and there's Tony Jannus. And so he was the high bidder. Apparently had money, but also he had wanted to. The story is he had been out and got stuck out in the boat one night and couldn't get back in with his little girl. And it really scared him. And so he wanted to buy the lights that are at the opening of the inlet to the basin there now. And so that's, go back to that picture. It's right here that he wanted to get the lights on. They're still there. They're historic lights, and so they bought those lights with that money. Here's the day that they actually flew, cranked up and get going. It's a little two-cycle Roberts engine. And
When you say cranked up, what do you mean?
Cranked up. He takes this is a handle, this is Tony, of course that's the flying boat, and there's a rod, a shaft, that goes back to the propeller. The engine is down inside the hull, and so it's a chain drive up to it. So instead of having an electric starter, you had to crank things, like an old car, a Model T car, a Model A car. And so he's actually, with this handle, long bar, pulling turning the propeller to turn the engine to get it to start. So that's the crank up. And you can kind of see, here's Tony, there's Persler. I don't think the file's in that picture. But, they were saying at least 3,000 people showed up to watch this thing take off. And that's a third of the city. I mean, that's a really big event in a kind of small town. So, again, January 1st, nobody's got anything else to do.
And is the runway the water?
Yes, it's a flying boat. Yeah, it's a flying boat. It's a seaplane. And, so it's two passengers side by side in here. Engine back in here with a propeller driving up there.
Was one of the passengers the mayor?
Yeah, Mayor File won the bid with $400.
Oh, okay.
So he got to be the first passenger to be taken over to Tampa. So this is them leaving. Apparently there were some movies, but unfortunately nobody's been able to find the movies that were done. And then they go over to Tampa, land up there close to, up in the river, and where the Kennedy crosses the river there, just next to the university. That's where they were docking in their little place to bring on new passengers. And so it's pretty interesting. One little tidbit about this, that the airplane, they found out, the Smithsonian plans showed the airplane being 26 feet. 25 feet. 26 feet. The actual airplane that turns out, though, is 27. But there's always this kind of struggle between St. Pete and Tampa, apparently. And so the port authority, what do you call it? The harbor master said, you can't fly this thing and bring it into our port unless you have a whatever ton steamship license. You know, so if you have a vessel over 26 feet. So they submitted drawings that showed 26 feet. And that's what the drawings were in the Smithsonian. And then so when they built the replica, our replica is actually a foot shorter than it should have been. That's the way we understand it. So anyway, here's the first woman to go ride a commercial airliner. She's got her hat on. She's doing great. And so her name's Mrs. Whitney. And that was January 8th. That's, so I guess she was the 8th passenger because they were flying every day. They would fly every day, 2 trips a day.
Do you know what happened to the original airport? Was it scrapped or?
The original airplane?
Yeah.
They took it back. They took it back up north after. You got to remember that St. Petersburg was almost dead. When it starts getting hot. So they were using those first 3 precious months of the winter when all the snowbirds were here in St. Pete to do this run, and then they hung it up and went back. So again, this starts to show you a little more clearly about these guys sitting in this boat that flies. Unfortunately, they with the little training airplane that they had down here, this German fella crashed it, and he was okay, but I guess he was not quite sure why, but the German government decided not to pay, even though I guess he was there on their behalf, getting training as the Germans. Then later they built hurt an airplane up north, but anyway, they took an airplane up north, they rebuilt it, and after it was broken up there, they named it the Florida, which was kind of interesting. And so when Tony Janus came back down in 15, it actually flew Mr. Gandy, George Gandy, gave him a ride, so I guess he could see what was involved in building the Gandy Bridge. Saying, gosh, if we could build that bridge, causeway, we don't have to pay these guys to fly us over there or drive all the way around. So, and then J.D. Smith, the mechanic, he built this flying boat. It's hard to see, but this is actually a boat and a biplane, and he flew it out of St. Pete, but when he landed over at Ballast Point, off of Tampa there, that he ended up, thing caught on fire and was destroyed. But he was okay, he jumped out in the water. It's a nice thing about the flying boat.
Why do you think that these first airplanes here were airboats, that they used water as the runway? Why was that?
Well, all over the country, that was a big benefit, that you almost have an instant, long, big airport.
Right.
Lake Tarpon, wherever, you all of a sudden have all these airports all over the place. So I think that's probably the main reason they were using water. Because there wasn't an airport in Tampa, and there really wasn't an airport in St. Pete. But there was you know, the
Water.
harbor, there was water all the way across. Plus you have a little security flying over water around there, because if you have an engine problem, you splash into the water, fix your problem, and take off again, as opposed to hope you find a cow pasture, or there weren't that many cow pastures for that matter at that time. So,
Did people fly on Lake Tarpon? Was there ever a recorded
flight off of Lake Tarpon?
Yeah.
You know, that's a good question. I'm sure Johnny Green, I'll talk about him in a minute, I'm sure he landed on Lake Tarpon.
Oh, wow.
But, and that's where I fly all the time. That's my home base. So this is Johnny Green. He was from Tennessee, Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was a motorcycle. He loved motorcycles. And Glenn Curtis, the guy I told you about, that did the Curtis airplane, whole series. Curtis did flying boats as well as that airplane with the flat, the ailerons I told you about. But he had a flying school down in Miami. Curtis was racing motorcycles on. His thing was he was really figured out how to build engines that could go in motorcycles and all. He would race in Daytona on the beach there, right? So that was his thing. But because he could do these engines, then he started, and he liked to go fast. He was a daredevil. Hey, flying's perfect for him. Let's build airplanes, use my motorcycle engines. And so he got into the airplane business. And so anyway, this guy Johnny Green, young kid, he's down because he loves motorcycles. He's down there messing with motorcycles, but then also learns to fly. And he loved the flying boats, so he bought two Curtis flying boats and brought them to St. Petersburg. And he set up a spot just next to the pier on the other side of where Janice worked. In fact, very close to the museum that is there now, the St. Petersburg Museum, on the entrance to the pier. And that's where his operation started out. And then he, with his two flying boats, and this is him. And they also set up this nightclub called the Green Lantern, which apparently was a big hit for a while. And so it's close to the History Museum, but this is him. The engine on this one is not in the hull, but it's up above. And that was a much more sophisticated flying boat than the original Benoit, which is much more fragile. And this is him and his passengers. He would do flight sightseeing trips, and in fact, and he was kind of really the aviator of Pinellas County, because he would fly all over the county, help and ride sightseeing trips. And he, in fact, we're pretty sure he's the one, when you see these aerial shots of Tarpon Springs, the old shots from the 30s, they were probably shot by him. In fact, they remember I had a friend, and her mother used to catch a ride with him in the bayous in Tarpon Springs. So, and then he was still, at Albert Whitted and competing with Albert Whitted. It was actually before the airport was called Albert Whitted, because Albert Whitted himself was down there, and he was hopping rides. He was a Pensacola guy, and flying from Pensacola with the Navy, and but then he was killed on one of his trips, and I'll talk about that in a moment.
I see a pattern here and again.
Excuse me? Yeah, another little theme. Another little theme. Yes, it was tough business. Janice, they started building these bigger, stronger machines and wanting to use for a bomber. We're getting close to World War I now, so he's trying to get a Navy contract, which didn't kind of work out. But then Benoit ended up being killed in St. Louis, Sandusky, which is where he was from. He was on a trolley car and hanging on the side of a trolley car, and a telephone pole. He was going by, a telephone pole caught him in the head and killed him. But if it wasn't for that, Benoit would be the place, instead of probably seeing so many Boeings and all, you'd be seeing Benoit airliners and Benoit jets and everything, because he was very bright, had a real business going. Then the group, the Florida Aviation and Historical Society, my dad got together with Russ Arnold. They were airplane buddies for years. And my dad, again, with his love of history and knowing something about Johnny Green and all there in Tarpon Springs, and having been grown up in St. Pete, he ended up getting with Russ, and they created the Florida Aviation and Historical Society. And so that organization's still going. It's, in fact, they're meeting today in St. Pete. They wanted me to come to the meeting. I said, no, I have this very formal event going on. And so, but anyway, so they created this thing, and Russ Arnold, who was also Clearwater Executive Airport, he was the one that paved those runways and ran that operation for years, back in the late 60s, 70s mainly, 70 to 85 or something like that. Anyway, he was a good promoter and kind of good. He didn't mind asking people for money. And my dad was the historian and the builder, because he's built 5 airplanes, designed them himself and built them. So not only is he an great interior designer, he did the Pappas' the restaurant. I was telling you. A number of places here in Clearwater, historic places now that on Gulf to Bay, just before you, Cleveland, when you drop off, just before you dropped off to go across the causeway to the bridge, to the old bridge, up there on top of the hill was the Townhouse Restaurant and the Circus Buffet. He also did John Baldwin's shop, which was right on the corner there on the south side of the street, which now I think it's the Capitol Theater is right next door to it. Anyway, so my dad got all their buddies together to build this thing. And so Hank Palmer from Albert Whitted, he has a long history at Albert Whitted. And he did the engine. He loves engines and stuff, so he did the center section of the engine. Another guy was in charge of all the wings and stuff. And my dad was in charge of the hull. And so they built these in different places, but then they would bring them together and see how they work. When they built the engine, or put the engine in, it was a Chevy Straight 6, not the original engine of the two-cycle, but a Chevy engine. They put that down in the hull, but they built all this as a mock-up, just so that they knew when they put it in what my dad was building, it was going to fit. And so that way they could work independently and get these things done. And they were having problems with the chain drive because the Chevy engine, it starts so quick that it would break the chains. They were constantly breaking chains until they figured out to retard the spark, make the magneto on a retard, so it would start softer. And this is when at Clearwater, they kind of started putting things together, the different pieces. And then this is the airplane assembled, the replica assembled, and so that was at my house up on Lake Tarpon. And this is back in '83, and what they were trying to do was do it to reenact the 70th anniversary of the first flight. And so then they did all the test flying out in front of my house, and out on Lake Tarpon. A couple of reasons. One is freshwater, but it's also kind of private. We didn't really want to have a lot of public watching things, and just in case it didn't work. The thing. It's a whole other story about a fellow that did one for St. Petersburg, and he's a very handsome, flamboyant guy, and he built this replica that wasn't very good, but he was kind of a media guy, and so he tells the paper he's going to test fly this thing and everything, and right there at Albert Whitted in Bayboro Harbor, and so all the TV cameras come down there and everything. This was in the '60s, and put on his crash helmet and everything, and he plows along, and it won't get on the step to be able to take off at all. And so, of course, this will be fully documented for the 6 o'clock news that he can't get it to fly. And then by the 11 o'clock news, they've edited it with the Lone Ranger music, and the thing just plowing along. So it really was embarrassing for the poor guy. And so that's it. We don't want to do that. If we're going to have a failure, let's have a quiet failure on our own.
Right.
But they were able to. He was able to get it to fly, and so this is it. Them working. There was a funny little story because of that chain drive. There's a couple of tubes that would protect the chain, and on one of the landings they got a little crack in the hull. It was bringing in a lot of water, so he's taxiing in or out there in the lake, and and because the chain drive, the sprocket is down, ends up being down in the water, and the chain is picking up the water and running it up through the tube, and then the tube takes it right up to the top there, and so then it was coming off the top of the chain around the prop, and then the wind would blow it back so to the back of the airplane. So it looked like this, and I was there. I was always with my boat there playing, sidekick, and then sometimes my other airplanes sidekick. But you saw this. It looked like the whole thing was on fire with this huge thing of mist, this smoke coming out of it. But it was just water spray. So they ended up getting it up there and trying to figure out. We fixed it. Things. And then they took it down to. It was a big, event. With the mayor, Mayor Friedman from St. Pete down there. So January 1st was a huge deal that he flew it across the bay. Cold morning. It was below freezing in the morning. At my house, I know because I tried to get my flying boat to go down and meet him, and it was so cold I had ice in the bilge. The water in the bottom of the airplane turned to ice. And but he flew it across out of St. Pete over to Tampa, to Davis Island, and then that's back at my house. So again, just briefly around Florida Central Avenue, you think about, just prior to World War I, they still had the trolley there. There was Pensacola, and then Miami were very, strong with their naval air bases. So, in fact, Johnny Green would bring he started, when they would deliver airplanes to him in St. Petersburg, he would build up these flying boats and then take them to Pensacola for the Navy, and then take them to Key West for the Navy. So he had a contract to do that. These are some of the airplanes. Pensacola, they would also do the dirigibles, which was pretty impressive until they broke. Chalk, some of you may remember Chalk Airlines down in Miami. They were the first international airlines. So they were flying these little airplanes across out to the Bahamas and stuff. And then they ended up being the oldest airline up until I think they quit in 1980. One of the wings came off of one of their Albatross airplanes, I believe. And but anyway, that was the longest running airline. But they were all flying off of water out of Miami. And then Pan Am started flying there too. And then there was the Aero Marine group. They're from New York, flying all the way down to Miami, and they were bootlegging. They were hauling a lot of liquor because this was during the the Prohibition time, and so but they would stop in Miami before they go to Cuba, Havana, pick up whatever they the booze, liquor, and all in there, and then fly back up. There's Weeden Island. Do you all know where the Weeden Island Preserve is? That's a building we designed years ago, the center. But it originally had a building on it, and that was actually where Eastern Airlines flew from. So that was a very, very active airport. And my dad, and then this is, of course, Pan American Airways. This was their operation down in Key Biscayne in Miami. But these are huge flying boats that they were flying across the down to South America and doing a route down there. So Lon Tripp, he's the one that started the airline down in Dinner Key. And the McMullen over in Tampa, Drew Field over there. What time do I need to be?
Whenever you want to finish.
Okay.
Take your time.
Try to pick up the pace a little bit. But Drew Field, Tampa International Airport, that was just a cow pasture. This guy Drew had cattle and he was a realtor and all over there. And but he also, Alex McMullen ended up creating a little bit of an airline working out of there too. But they're flying off this grass field and they had a little airport there. And that's actually where my father soloed when he was 17 on this big airplane here called a Fledgling. Because I had a hard time picturing Tampa International being a grass, pasture. But even when they had the airline going in and out of there, they would have to, shoe the cow because they kept the cows in the pasture.
Oh my goodness.
And so then this Albert Whitted, after flying all these people, he was...
Fatally crashed.
Yeah. And since he was kind of
keeps coming back.
Yeah, he was kind of the St. Petersburg's native son. So when they dredged and built the airport, Albert Whitted Airport, they dredged that up. That's all fill out there that the city named it for him. So this is an interesting little airplane that's the Ford Flivver. Henry Ford decided that he wanted to get in the airplane business, that he can build airplanes. Of course, later he did the Ford Tri-Motor, but he was also trying to do the little guys, get into little small airplanes. So he was trying to set a record of flying from Michigan to Miami nonstop. And so the kid next door, on the farm next door, was a kid named Harry Brooks, and so he decided he was going to fly the airplane, and so they filled it up with fuel. He left out of Michigan and flew all the way down and got along to. He was trying to do it nonstop. Got along off of Sebastian Inlet. The story is that he's flying down low. He sees a couple of, Sebastian, a little further, Titusville. He had problems and had to land on the beach. When he landed on the beach, he broke a propeller. Had to spend a week getting the new propeller made and brought down to him. And so then he takes off again, and then he's flying on south down the beach, cruising the beach, which I've done a number of times. And then he sees these couple of pretty girls. And so he says, it's a young, handsome kid, goes around, makes a turn to come back, circle back to him, and he crashes in the water. I think he was too low. He got his wing in the water and did a cartwheel and killed him. And so the Henry Ford was because this kid was like his nephew, because he's very close to the farm people next door. So he scrapped the whole program. But if that had not been the case, instead of seeing Cessna, Piper, and all those guys, you'd be seeing Ford airplanes as well. So that's why Ford is not in the airplane business. We did Historical Society did a replica of this, built mostly from the Clearwater guys, EAA chapter there in Clearwater, here in Clearwater, I should say, out at the airport. And they built this airplane. My dad did one test flight with it, and then I did all the other all the other test flying with it. Each one of these things I could give a whole talk on, but I won't. So, but that was an interesting little small engine. Of course, Central Avenue, St. Pete in the 30s is the place to be. That's before the yellow fever. I mean, when people had TB or whatever, St. Pete was so great because you could be on a peninsula of a peninsula. So health-wise, people came to St. Pete for their health. Doctors would all say, "Hey, go to St. Pete." So it was a pretty thriving place until the Depression. The B-line, this was before they had the Skyway Bridge. So you had the B-line was a ferry that you could get on, get your car on, and take over to Palmetto over there on the south side of Tampa Bay. And they were doing big air shows and stuff. This 1929, you have Amelia Earhart is there in Miami. She spent a lot of time here in Florida, as well as Lindbergh. Lindbergh was used in Florida to launch a lot of his things when he was checking for Pan Am, doing the searches for new routes. Lindbergh's been into St. Pete, to Albert Whitted. There's some pictures of him there. So it's pretty interesting. Roscoe Turner, who was a race pilot, they were racing airplanes and all, particularly after the World War I. So got Ted Baker here. He started National Airlines in Albert Whitted. So that's, National Airlines is pretty big. In fact, it was the 12th largest airline in the world back in the 70s. So it's a very, very successful group. My dad actually worked for them when he was in high school, washing airplanes and all. And being a mechanic, yes, a jillion stories about that. My dad's father was here in 1913 in St. Pete and passed away during the Depression. So my dad was only 12 years old when his dad died. But the guys down at the airport took care of him and became his friends and taught him to fly and let him be a mechanic and got him really interested in airplanes. So then they got fancier airplanes. This is over in Lakeland. They were doing a route. Then back to Wheaton Island. Wheaton Island was, the Sky Harbor Airport, they called it, was a hub for Eastern Airlines flying out of Miami, working more the other coast, but this was their St. Pete stop. And it's really interesting, they're in the grass there, but, all the ladies are dressed up, everybody's dressed up. The outfits and getting on and off the airplanes, very, very formal, very fun. Then, of course, this is the Wheaton Island Airport. The Environmental Education Center is right out in here now. It was an airport that remained not only just for Eastern Airlines with their airline terminal there, but all these airplanes and all the cars. But they would have these air shows and fly-ins and all. It was a very active place.
Is there any remnants from Wheaton Island
Yes.
Airport?
Yeah, there's a piece of the terminal actually
wow.
there. The hangar is completely gone, but the terminal building, there's part of the foundation and some of the tiles on the floor. Unfortunately, I don't believe even though we were involved in the design of the building, they spent most of their focus on the pre-contact, which is fine, it's good, but there's not a lot on the airport because it's a famous airport, and non-airplane people don't necessarily appreciate it, So anyway, so it was kind of a really happening place. My dad, when he was a kid, there was a bridge over to Wheaton Island back then, and so they would have the air shows there instead of down in at Albert Whitted, because at Albert Whitted, whatever air show you're doing, people could just stand on Central Avenue and watch it happen, and do the loops and stuff. So they moved them. Most of the air shows were out here so that he could collect money. My dad was there, collecting tickets and stuff. when cars would come across the bridge, he'd ride his bicycle up there. And pretty good little ride from where he lived in downtown St. Pete next to the airport. And so anyway, that was kind of a humorous kind of a thing. And he has stories about the airplanes with a Ford Trimotor doing this thing where he would drag his wing in through the grass on takeoff, get up, and then actually do a loop right at the end when he took off, did a loop. And the Trimotor, that's a big airplane. So, well, of course, Pinellas had, Albert Whitted Airport, 1927. Piper Fuller is another airport that was a real active airport that was on the west side of town, where Admiral Farragut is, back in that area. That was all an airport, a thriving airport. And in fact, the city was really planning on that being the big airport. And the Admiral Farragut building was one of the hotels that they were using because the airport was kind of a destination spot. So, and I guess you could still, if you looked on it, you could see where the runways actually were. Then, of course, the Sky Harbor started out as Grand Central, became Sky Harbor before Wheaton. Then there's Clearwater Airport, there's Tarpon Springs, and then there's St. Pete Clearwater, which was referred to as Pinellas.
And were there any flights from Fort DeSoto to Egmont Key, or not?
Not that I'm aware of.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where was the Tarpon Springs Airport?
I'll show you that in just a minute.
Okay.
So here are the airplane. Here's of course, the Wheaton Island Airport here. It's called Sky Harbor. There's Albert Whitted downtown here, and this is where Tony Jannus was flying around MacDill up into the river, Hillsborough River, there where the Kennedy Bridge now goes across. Drew Field, which was the big cow pasture I talked about.
Yes.
He owned a lot of this cow pasture, this West Shore area. And then Clearwater Air Park up here where we are. And then this is Piper Fuller Airport, where I said about Admiral Farragut over
Yes.
here. A big operation going. And then what became the biggest, well, not bigger than Tampa, of course, but a big one was St. Pete Clearwater Airport here. Tarpon Springs. Alex had mentioned that Dunedin had a little airport too. That really should be there. And good. This, of course, Clearwater Air Park here now, and then you could, apparently, it really started, the Clearwater Air Park started back over by Crest Lake down here. But then as the city grew, people moved out around the airport, then complained about the airplanes, so then they moved out again. And they're still complaining about the airplanes, but this was changed to a paved runway, one runway with the golf course, in about 1970, 71. But I flew out of this airport, I soloed on my 16th birthday. I'm still here, by the way. I am yet to be.
Congratulations.
I'm yet to be one of those goners.
Right.
But if you look at, look at the board here, this is the airport as it was when I flew. I took off and landed on this airport, on this runway, November 19th.
Was it purposely designed to look like an A almost?
No. The reason for airports, the original airports were cow pastures, and so you could just take off into the wind any which way you wanted to go.
Oh, okay.
And then this is, so
So
this is kind of the best way to be able to say, okay, we got this crosswind, we got the sea breeze coming off the Gulf, let's have this runway. Or we got that north cold front, so let's use that runway. It's safer to take off into the wind. But then you end up with a point where you can only afford to have one runway, land-wise. So, so that's why that was. You asked about Tarpon Springs. This is down, of course, the sponge docks are here. This is this picture was taken 2 days after my birthday. After I was born, I should say. My original birthday.
Oh, wow.
Tarpon Springs, Kramer Bayou, Whitcomb Bayou. This spring downtown Tarpon is right here,
Okay.
but the airport was out here. Where if you ever go out to Fred Howard Park,
Yes.
which is out, excuse me, it's right. I think they built a causeway off of here, but that intersection between Florida Avenue and I'm trying to remember the name of the street, but it was here 2 runways that were still here. And then they built, of course, it's all a subdivision now. That's the way of most airports. Bellevue, Biltmore was used by the Air Force as their housing for pilot training. Arcadia was a big, huge field. The big thing about Florida is the weather is so great all year round, so they can train all year round. They don't have to deal with all these other issues. And so this was, my dad would tell me about the reason they would fly out of here, but this again, it was a big field, so they'd land into the wind any which way. And so these young guys would go off to see the girls, and when they got some leave, they would fly over to Daytona Beach to land on the beach and try to, meet the girls, right? So, but unfortunately, a lot of them didn't know how to deal with crosswinds because they're always landing into the wind here. But when they go to Daytona, the beach only runs one way, and there's usually a wind coming on shore, so they would tear up the airplanes there and get in big trouble. But anyway, so my dad said there are a lot of Jenny airplane parts. This is World War I stuff over there. So, and then Jimmy Doolittle, right after just a few, 4 months after the Pearl Harbor, they're over there training in Pensacola, Florida, to be able to fly off those B-25s off the aircraft carriers to deliver and drop their bombs in Tokyo, to do the Tokyo raid, which, because we were hurt so bad and so scared, the idea is to get over and make a statement of some kind. Unfortunately, they were just about all killed or shot or whatever. It's a horrible situation, but it made a real impact. But that's a Florida event, So, and then I'm going to. How long have I been talking about? 45 minutes. Yeah. So I'm going to go through this real quick. I call it the Plan B perspective. They call this thing Flight 2014. This is St. Pete, a bunch of guys in St. Pete. Will Michaels, he's huge in there, big guy in the historical society there, and along with the Florida Aviation Historical Society, decided they wanted to do the 100th anniversary and make a big deal out of the 100th for the first flight. And so we did that, and they asked me to, and it was really a big event with Kermit Weeks. Fantasy of Flight over there on I-4. Yeah. Well, he's a guy, very adventurous, very flamboyant, very wonderful guy. He ends up doing with all his different airplanes, a marvelous, group of airplanes that he has. Some real sophisticated stuff. Anyway, he gets his crew to build. He wanted to do a really close replica. So they spent a couple of years working on a replica of the Benoit flying boat. And in fact, they did a reverse engineering of the engine that was in the museum to get an exact replica of the engine and use that. And they tried to get very close. Anyway, so the whole thing was come to St. Petersburg, watch them fly, watch Kermit Weeks fly the Benoit flying boat. And so that was the way it was advertised for months. But the guys told me, said, just in case, you need to be our plan B, just in case it doesn't work out for whatever reason. Because some of these things don't work out. And so this is my just kind of little take. I'm going to take you through here pretty quick. Again, this is Fassler, the mayor, the old mayor, and Tony Janis. He's the one that paid the money to go for the ride in this machine. And one thing, you just see all the people, the crowd of people. And look at these guys up on poles.
Wow.
You know, I mean, they're back trying to get a view. People were really excited about this. Another thing to look at is the color of the gray tones. They weren't white wings. You see his pants were white. But that's one thing I think they missed on their replica. This is my dad. Just going to give you a little background of my dad and where I'm coming from. This was him at Albert Whitted as a young fella. His little airplane that he had built. This was him during the war. He was in England for 3 years. This is his first little airplane flying over Clearwater. He designed and built that one. And then we lived on Lake Tarpon, so he built this little flying boat. He and I were flying it around in the shop.
Wow.
While it's under construction. That's the little airplane. One sits here, one sits back here. And then he built a third one, a little quicker. And that little flying boat we were flying around. This was, unfortunately, the airplane that Fred Pasno was killed in. His daughter became the astronaut. Nicole Stott.
Yes.
She's our famous Clearwater girl. She's a sweetheart. She's a dear friend of mine. And then, of course, he also built this little flying boat. He's getting skin cancers, so he wanted to make an airplane that he could be in the shade.
Oh, cool.
This was one of the test flight shots. And this was that morning that he flew. And then this is his flight over. While we were flying over together, he was going to go circle around. I've kind of gone back to 1984. When he was flying over to, I was flying alongside, and he was pointing up to, there's this long shaft that goes from the propeller, holding on the propeller, and it goes up to the front, just to keep it from, and then this is X-braced with wires here to hold that center point. So when the propeller's going around, everything's lined up and stays straight. Well, he's flying along, and he starts pointing up to me, and it's one of these wires, one of the 4 wires broke, and so this thing is starting to wobble. And if that shaft lets go, this propeller goes all kinds of havoc then, and that's a very, very dangerous situation. So instead of flying around doing circles around their spot at Tampa, he just went straight in and landed, called it quits.
Now, that's an escort helicopter in the back?
Yes, yeah, they had 30 airplanes, like a bunch of bumblebees.
Wow.
And this is me. I'm flying the other little flying boat, little two-place, so kind of flying escort for my dad.
Oh, nice.
So anyway, so this is kind of where Plan B, I'd said, comes in. So this is Kermit. This is his airplane, a magnificent machine. It was just the Saturday before. I flew my airplane over there. He has a grass runway. I could land with another one of my airplanes, and helped him put it in the water. And then he took it. Wind was blowing pretty good. This is offshore, so but out there the wind's pretty good. So, but he goes out there, and I go up on this little stand up here with a couple other guys, and Kermit's down there, taxi's downwind fine, and he turns around, he comes back into the wind to take off, and the guy next to me says, "Boy, he's really that Kermit is really being a careful, conscious, pilot, cautious pilot." And I said, "Yeah, but he's giving it all it can go, because it's not getting in the air.
Oh, wow.
He's just plowing along. And it's like, I guess I'm moving from Plan B to Plan A.
Okay.
So that's when I was like, oh no, because this is the Saturday afternoon before the Wednesday morning flight reenactment. So I only had 2-3 days to switch gears. these are some of my buddies from Clearwater. He has a carburetor shop here, and here in town, close to the airport. So anyway, so I'm up with a little flying boat, and so they had all these things planned. So Kermit was there giving a talk, and about his airplane, and I said, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to fly, but anyway, so there's all these festivities at night. This is New Year's Eve, and I'm a nervous wreck, but all these people are inviting me to do different things. He has his airplane on display there next to the water where we're going to fly, the Vinoy Basin. And so the morning of the flight, of course, I get to bed at about 3 or 2:30 or so. I get a little bit of sleep, get up at 5:30, and it's blowing like crazy. Front come through, it's blowing, it was rainy, it was cold. My wife and I go down to the water and see at the entrance of the basin, the Vinoy Basin, and it's waves just crashing against spray, and it was dark, of course, because this is winter, so January 1st, so short days. And so watching all this, and it's like, gosh, this is really nervous situation. And so my wife said, don't do it. All right? But all these guys have been planning for so long for this to happen. So that morning, these guys, I'm not here because I'm over at the airport at Albert Whitted getting my airplane ready because it's amphibious, go off land or water. So they're, they have all these kind of things, reenactors and all this kind of stuff going on. So I take off out of Albert Whitted. I'm talking to the control tower. He says, the winds are blowing 17, gusting to 27, which for a little airplane is a lot of. So I go up and take off, and I fly around, and I came over by the condos, trying to just kind of check it out, and then the controller, and then I come back around again. And I'm talking to the control tower all this time. No other airplanes, nobody's flying that day. And so when I came by those other condos, that's pretty close. He says, well, I guess I'm going to get a couple of phone calls from them this morning. But anyway, so I come around, and then I line up, and I land in the Vinoy Basin right here. The hotel's right over there. Land out there, and it's normally it's pretty tight, but it worked out fine. And so I come back, and it's drizzling, and here's Kermit Weeks. Somebody took a picture of him, taking a picture of me. so he's a fine fellow. But anyway, I'm out there, and then they're trying to get a boat to me, but this boat's too big to get in next to me, so they end up having to send out a little dinghy to get me. And it's raining, and it's cold, and it's just a mess. So that's my little airplane that my dad designed and built. So this guy rows up, picks me up, and we go back in. Congratulations by Kermit. And then this is Doc Brown. He's the one that wrote the book. So he was there. And there was press. I can't tell you how much press there was, because this is, when you think about the 100th anniversary of commercial flight, I mean, the commercial aviation is huge around the world. I mean, it's one of the biggest industries in the world. And this, St. Petersburg, was the beginning. So it's pretty, it really puts us on the map. And, St. Pete, where I was born, but Pinellas County, or Florida, so anyway, so there's, Al Jazeera had some of the best coverage, but it was all the main news. There were 365 news media outlets that covered it around the world. And I had a lot of phone calls, interviews before the flight, the day before, from But it was in Paris, in Australia, just everywhere. Because a couple of reasons. Because it's a real big deal, but it's also January 1st is a pretty slow news day. Everybody's home. So anyway, but then these guys had also done all this planning for me, about all these waypoints they had with the Coast Guard and the police and everything, about all they're trying to clear my path all the way around the bay to get from St. Pete to Tampa, and this waypoint to that waypoint to that waypoint. And I said, I'm just going to, if nobody's on my way, we don't need to do, I'm just going to go fly. So anyway, this is the briefing where they're telling me all this kind of stuff. And yeah, really. And there were all these people, a lot of people out there getting wet. They had little stands. They were also doing simulcast with a big screen over here that's not in any of the pictures, that you could actually on your phone be able to follow the whole flight, and events before and here and there. And so this is the event. Here I am. That's the mayor. Everybody else getting wet. TV celebrities making introductions. This is Will Michaels holding the umbrella for me while I got to do my little talk. And it was miserable, blowing, just crummy. There's I call it the Brits. This guy from England was there taking pictures, so I'm going to go through these real quick. I get out there, get in the airplane, and go into the back. They're rowing me out there, and get in the airplane, and then go way back into the back corner. The wind was out of the north. This is heading west towards downtown. The Vinoy Basin, the Vinoy Hotel is over here. The museum is back here. So I go around way back in that corner back there and do my takeoff run to give me as much length, because I don't have a whole lot of length in there. So I'm going to go through real quick. So my takeoff, the engine, unfortunately, I got one of the cylinders is down real low on compression, and because I didn't have time to rebuild the engine before this whole event. So I didn't have that much power, so I was struggling. But then the wind, there was more swells. It's amazing how many swells come in through that opening in the breakwater there. And so I got to have these big kind of swells that I was hitting and being bounced all over the place. And the wind's coming off the hotel and those towers, the condo towers, coming out of the northeast, was swirling around there. So it's just giving me all kinds of terrible time. But we finally got it in the air. And then I realized a really significant problem. It was a little bit horrifying, quite honestly, that I did not realize when I was looking out there in the dark the night before, or that morning in the dark. I did not notice that there's a piling up here that's about 12 feet tall, right there. And so I took this picture later, of course. But there were all these people here, and there were all these people here. The wind's blowing from here. I'm kind of over on this side. So I was trying to get between. If I caught that piling, I was a goner. And I sure don't want to take out anybody here. So, and the thing is not climbing to get over it. So I had to kind of, fly right through here with all that gusty wind and everything. So that was kind of a wild ride, but
it looks like you got quite a bit higher in this picture.
Oh, I'm past that.
Yeah.
That and everything is here. That's when I got out there, got away.
So how long did it take you to get past 12 feet over the water?
It took me the whole length of the basin.
Of the base.
And then when I went out through that inlet,
then
I was finally out and took some clear air.
Okay.
And I could climb.
And do you think that Janice had the same?
Oh, I'm sure he had to deal with a lot of that kind. He didn't have any big condos.
Right.
Throwing out tar pits.
Or that pile.
Yeah, I just, well, the other thing is that the frustration when I'm sitting there trying to decide, you know, Will Michaels up on the stage looks down at me and says, well, Ed, are we going to go? And in NASA teams, when those astronauts go, they have that whole room of people. Go flight, you know, all these different things. You know, my heart monitor, all my vital signs, you know, all that kind of, the weather guys, you know, the wind's blowing this amount of, you know, all those kind of decisions. But I don't have that team.
No.
It was just, they said, Eddie, are you going to fly? And so, and I had all these guys and it was IFR, really, IFR conditions.
It was what?
Instrument flying conditions, not visual.
Right. But you were flying visual.
Exactly.
Oh.
But I'm also flying low and slow, so it's, you know, I'm not up in the clouds. But it was pretty weak. I also have Captain, what's his name? Captain Al, I think, is a helicopter guy for Channel 8, or Channel 10. Anyway, he was flying as my main escort. Unfortunately, his picture isn't in here, but
And what can the escort do? I mean, they can watch you get in trouble.
Yeah, well, that's part of it. He knows where I am.
Uh-huh.
But he was also doing all the photography for the news.
Okay. Oh, yes.
You know, so we were riding together, and they wanted to get this caption. In fact, if you have another couple minutes, I'll show you the news clip, which kind of summarizes all this much better than I'm doing, actually. But anyway, so this is what I was talking about, coming around these condos and stuff.
Oh, gosh.
And so people up here had a nice view looking down on me. And the helicopter, there were 3 helicopters flying with me. And then this was another friend's sequence. This guy John, he's from Daytime. He did a little sequence here. But this shows more of he was a little closer and was showing more when I was behind the other coming around. But again, hitting some of this rough water where this thing did some crazy jumps and stuff that I'd never had happen. I scared my wife to death.
So you were bouncing.
Yeah, so now I'm down in the water, then I'm coming out, it's bucking me like a bucking bronco.
Well, Janice probably had better weather.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
He probably didn't fly that day, because that airplane was really laggy, slow on the controls. It was, my airplane's high performance airplane compared to that Benoit flying boat. Yeah, so I'm sure they don't necessarily talk about it, but I'm sure there were days they said, "No, we're not going to do this," when a front goes through. So anyway, it's kind of a wild ride till I could finally get it under control and get it out there.
I will.
But anyway, so it finally breaks, and I'm finally in the air, and I've seen other videos that I did not get high enough to cross that piling. So you can kind of see how low I am.
Yeah.
And then there are more people out on the point, which is right there. Anyway, that's the old pier. And so I circled around a time or two, and there's another helicopter there, and then this is some of the, captured from the footage. So while I'm doing all this, the people in Tampa are waiting on me, and they're the other half of the story, because they're the recipients of the first scheduled airline. So they had a big deal going. But they're over there partying, and they're inside, pouring champagne.
You're cold, aren't you?
I'm freezing.
You're cold.
Oh, yeah.
You're
cold and wet.
wet.
But they're over there having a party with champagne, and nobody's sitting outside. And they were doing the simulcast, with this just happened to be with later they had but they had my flight being all recorded on this Jumbotron thing. But you could also see it on your phone. But they come out and they're watching when I finally get closer. And so I, circled around a couple of times. And, the helicopters. I have some real interesting footage with that real still camera following right behind me. Seeing the airplane and the landing and all with the video is very fascinating. But anyway, so I come in and I land very uneventfully into the wind and turn this into a movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, wow, you're pretty low there.
Yeah, there's another. Yeah, so that's down on the water when it settles in, and this is my. There was a. This is a fireboat. They were shooting water, kind of the welcoming water, shooting water, and then they were. This is kind of my James Bond shot, dun 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 dun, because they had the water spraying, and the two police boats and the helicopter, and there was actually two other helicopters. So that was a pretty. Then it was kind of like, okay, well, I'm here. All I got to do is get this thing back to the beach. There's low tide, and so I had to get out with my shoes. I'm all soaked, bare feet. And then I had to set up my anchor because I was going to be leaving over to the podium for all the...
And you didn't have to change your clothes all day, did you?
Oh, no.
No. So
And this is Joe Pano. He's the head of Tampa International Airport.
Oh, okay.
He was there to greet me. He had 2 bottles of champagne. He gave me 1 bottle to take with me, and then the other bottle, he started pouring champagnes, which is very, very thoughtful. But, for him, I mean, that's his business, commercial airlines. This was replicating the first trip 100 years ago.
Wow.
And so, anyway, it's fun. We toasted each other, and this camera guy was in my face all the time. But and his secretary, it was nice. There was a group of people. I had to throw in this little thing where I say, Joe, now that we have amphibious aircraft at St. Pete Tampa Airboat Line, we need a gate at TIA. so,
Yes.
but he's a swell fella. I like him a lot. So anyhow, like I say, the guy was in my face. I still haven't seen that footage that he took. But they had this 1912 car, Rolls Royce, which I get in barefooted, wet, holding my shoes, and put my shoes on so that I could get out. And this is Will Michaels, a history St. Pete guy. This fellow's from the airport, TIA, and other people that were on the committee. So it was fun. The reenactor had made it over there. And then I got to say a few little things. I had pictures here that I carried with me of my dad doing the same flight.
Oh, wow.
So it was nice. It's nice to be in Tampa. It's like, whew, I was so relieved.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the heroes, the little airplane sitting out there that made it. And I flew my son, put it on the gear. One thing I'd never done before, I had to actually fly the airplane back around and land it at the airport, get it put away in the hangar because the weather was so bad. But it's the first time I ever flew after drinking. Yeah, after that champagne, I had to, because they don't, you can come out of the water there, but you can't get through the gate. The gate's not big enough to get for a seaplane to get to the airport. Because it's right there on the airport. But anyway, so I flew, just circled around and landed, and then got the airplane back home. So it was like, whew, that's done. It's kind of the end of the day. I took my dad for a ride. This was before that. He never got to see this event. But this is his last flight. And then right after that, there was Tavares had, Tony Jannus flew his flying boat over there. So they were having their first seaplane to arrive in Tavares. And Tavares now is calling themselves the Seaplane City of America. It's really wonderful that a city has adopted seaplanes as their theme. That's their tourist draw. And so they have a beautiful park and all dedicated to that. So they wanted me to come over, and give me a free hotel and all this
Champagne.
champagne. Go for more champagne, exactly. Exactly. So, but that engine, I told you that engine was running bad. And so I had...
Now we just saw your hand. What happened to it now?
Well, the typical old man mechanic kind of a thing. I pulled the engine completely out of it. Of course, you get some battle scars doing stuff. And so it worked till 3 o'clock in the morning, getting the engine out. Pulled all the cylinder off. They look like my little buddies, don't they?
Yeah.
That's intake and exhaust. But anyway, got it flying, flew it over there, and it all worked out fine to where his prop was getting chewed up. And then flying it back.
What a beautiful shot that is.
And I use my, just use my iPhone. I have a program on it where I can just, so now you can really, really cheat and just follow the line. It's different. That's Brooks, flying it home to the Brooksville airport. When I get to the Brooksville airport, I put the landing gear down so I can land, and I taxi up to to my hangar and shut things down. Then I'm ready to get out. I can't get out. My pants are jammed into the landing gear mechanism. So, and I can't get them free. So I had to take my pants off. I had to slide out of my pants and get out of the airplane. Left them in there until I could do a little work on them. So that was kind of a crazy deal. This is the new brand new, spanking new. This is in February. The replica up, I mean, it's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship that they all talk about. Well, what a beautiful sculpture these guys did and all. Well, it is a beautiful sculpture, but it's plagiarized, completely, perfectly plagiarized in terms of being very close to the original airplane.
And where is this?
This down on the waterfront in St. Pete.
Oh, is it?
When you go out the pier, out there, it'll be on the right-hand side, the south side, this is right where the hangar was. Remember that old wood building I showed you? This is where the hangar was, and this is where Tony Janice was flying, around in the basin here, and parking here. So, yeah, and so my dad, the one they did, is hanging up in the museum in St. Pete.
Oh, wow.
It's painted green. And then they did, some other fellows made just a kind of a copy of it, and that's hanging in, my dad helped them, and that's hanging up at the baggage claim at St. Pete Clearwater Airport.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and this is my airplane, one of my airplanes. And
Wow.
this is my dad's first airplane I had shown you earlier, and he's flying. That's when I flew that to Oshkosh for their 70th.
It looks like it's about to rain.
And it was. That's why I didn't leave that day. I had to wait till the next morning to fly to Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And for their flying, they treated me royally. That was nice. And this is back home, sweet home. This is I call it a seaplane base in Tarpon Springs on Lake Tarpon.